Good morning. My name is Professor Deborah Harmon, and today I'm going to be talking to you about APA 7th edition. In this session, I'm going to talk about in-text citations, referenceless citations, and then finally the APA paper format. One important distinction I wanted to point out is that this session is going to be talking about the APA 7th edition. The APA 7th edition came out in October 2019. There are a number of changes between the 6th edition and the 7th edition, so make sure you clarify with your professor whether you're using the 6th edition or the 7th edition. Again, this session is focusing on the 7th edition of the manual. So now we're going to talk about APA in-text citations. One thing to note about APA in-text citations is these are the citations within the actual body of your paper itself. So this is how you let your reader know that, hey, I'm pulling this information from somebody else, and this is always going to correspond to something in your reference list. So with APA in-text citations are a name-date citation style, and so every time we have a name, we need to have a date. And the first thing we need to pay attention to is whether our article has 1 to 2 authors or 3 or more authors, because this is going to change how we articulate the in-text citation. So let's look at how we do a citation for 1 to 2 authors in APA. So if we have 1 to 2 authors, we write all the authors' names out every single time we see them. There are 2 major types of citations in APA. Either you can do a narrative citation or you can do a parenthetical citation. Sometimes we see students want to put the full name of the article in the paper. Don't do that. Since APA is a name-date citation, all you need to do is put the author and the date. So for example, here is a narrative citation with 1 author, a study by Bowden, 2019. So you notice you put the author's last name followed by the year. And the next one is an example of 2 authors. So we have research by Horn, and then write out the word and, Harmon, 2018, and then we continue on with our citation. The other major type of in-text citation that we see is a parenthetical citation. So this is kind of like a little abbreviated statement at the end of our citation. And so if we have 1 author, we simply write out the author's last name, followed by a comma, and then the date of the source. And if we have 2 authors, we write out the authors, and then we join that with the ampersand sign, which is the little abbreviated and, follow that with a comma, and then include the year. Now we're going to look at what to do when we have 3 or more authors. And so if we have 3 or more authors for an APA in-text citation, all we need to do is list the first author followed by this phrase, et al. One thing you'll note is there is not a period after the ET, there's only a period after the AL. And so for a narrative citation, all we need to do is list Harmon et al. And then the year that it was published. And for a parenthetical citation, so that little abbreviated citation, we list Harmon et al. Followed by a period, then a comma, and then the year. One thing we sometimes see students try to do is they take an individual article and then reorganize those authors so that they're alphabetical. Don't do this. The person who is listed as the first author is the one that did the most work, so they get first credit. And so make sure you just take the first author that you see listed on the article. That is the one that you need to include in your narrative citation. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to do a direct quote, and then I'm also going to talk about how you do and indicate to your reader that you're doing a paraphrase. So in APA, you need 3 primary pieces of information when you have a direct quote. You need the author, the date, and the page number. And so there are 2 primary ways to articulate this. So if we have a narrative citation, we start writing out according to Jones, 1998, and then we include the text in quotation marks. And remember, a direct quote is when I'm reading something and I'm taking that exact same language and I'm including it in my paper. And so I need to let my reader know where that came from. And so this is why I'm going to include the page number. So Jones, 1998, the actual quote, and at the very end of the quote, I'm going to include the page number. One thing you'll also notice is that the period is after the page number and not within the sentence. We see this a lot of times. People try to put the page number period right here. That actually needs to be after the page number statement. Now, another way to articulate this is if you include your citation, your in-text citation in a parenthetical citation. For a direct quote, we still need those three pieces of information. So we need the author or authors, the date, and then the page number. And so we started out with a quote and then include our parenthetical and close that with a period. Now, sometimes we don't have page numbers. So if you're ever looking at a website, sometimes ebooks don't have page numbers. If we are using a direct quote, we still need to indicate to our reader where we got that from. So this would be the same whether it be a narrative or parenthetical. We need to include the author, the date, and then instead of the page number, we include the paragraph number. And so we indicate this by putting para, period, and then we actually count down the number of paragraphs so that our reader can go and find that individual paragraph. Now, this is an example for a pretty short work. We know this is in paragraph 6. If you have a super long work, make sure you dig a little bit deeper because APA does have some guidance for how to do a page number for something that's a little bit for a long. So now we're going to talk about paraphrases. So paraphrasing is effectively when you put something you've read into your own words. And so this isn't just changing out words like with the thesaurus. This is really kind of synthesizing and putting something that you've read into your own words. And what you'll notice with your writing is that as you progress, a lot of times we start out and we're using and leaning on more and more direct quotes. But as you advance in your studies and as you advance as a writer, you'll notice that more and more you will be paraphrasing. So for a paraphrase, you only need two pieces of information. If you have a narrative citation, all you need is the author and the date, and then afterwards you kind of include what you paraphrased. Or alternately, you can include what you paraphrase and then end that with a parenthetical thing with just the author and the date. There's no need to put a page number for a parenthetical citation. And again, all this is on page 269 through 270 of the APA manual. Abbreviations in APA. Now, sometimes we have corporate authors. So sometimes a source is not authored by an individual, but an agency like the CDC, the National Institute of Mental Health, the American Psychological Association, American Nurses Association. So these will oftentimes have common abbreviations. And so what APA permits us to do is as we're writing if we're using something as a source and it has a common abbreviation, what we can do is establish that source and establish the abbreviation. And then thereafter, we only need to put the abbreviation when we reference that corporate author. So for example, in a narrative citation, if I see something by the American Psychological Association, I can put the abbreviation APA along with the date, so APA, comma, and then date. And then every other time I reference that work, all I need to do, so the subsequent instances, I can either do APA 2019 or parenthetical APA 2019. Alternately, if the first time I see this and I want to abbreviate it, it's in a parenthetical citation, I can articulate American Psychological Association, and then in square brackets, I can indicate to my reader that I'm looking at something from APA, follow that with a comma, and then the year, and then every subsequent time I can either do APA 2019 or APA 2019. Again, all of this is on page 268 of the APA 7th edition manual. So in addition to in-text citations, one of the concerns that APA provides some guidance on within the text is how we deal with numbers. And so on page 178 through 179 of the APA 7th edition manual, we can see some guidance for how to deal with numbers in APA. So numbers 1 through 9 are expressed as words, and numbers 10 and above are expressed as numerals. So for example, the control group contains 17 participants. That's because that's 10 and above, so that's numeric. 9 of whom were female and 8 of whom were male. Since this is under 10, we write out the entire word. Now this is the general rule for numbers, but it wouldn't be APA if there weren't exceptions. I consider these the age, date, and math exceptions. So if you have a age, it will always be numeric. If you have a date, it will always be numeric. If you have a unit of time, it will always be numeric. If you have a percentage of something, it will always be numeric. The only exception to the exception is if they begin a sentence. You never want to begin a sentence with a number. So for example here, I have 2% over here because usually, since this is the math exception, I only have to do it numerically. But since 48% begins the sentence, instead of starting that with a number, I'm actually going to write out that entire phrase, so 48%. So, in sum, if it's age, date, or math, write it out numerically unless it begins a sentence. One of the things we see students struggle with a lot is how to balance in-text citations within a long paraphrase. So if you're writing a paper, maybe you're doing a literature review, and you talk about one source throughout an entire paragraph. What we see students sometimes do is put a citation at the end, sometimes put it at the beginning, but there's more of an art to it. And so the first thing you need to do when you're talking about one source, and so you're paraphrasing one source, what we do is we need to let our reader know, first of all, that we're talking about a source, that we're paraphrasing the ideas of an individual article. So this is an example of an article written by one person. And so what we do is we kind of let our reader know that we're talking about Long 2018's article. So we started out with Long 2018 described. Now, instead of trying to do a citation at every single sentence, since we're still talking about the same source, what you can do is you can kind of weave that thread throughout the paragraph. So you can see here, instead of putting another in-text citation at the next sentence, what we do is we weave that thread by saying, the author went on to outline. They listed the following common mistakes. Long 2018 argues. And so you can see here, especially with the author went on and they listed the following, that we're kind of maintaining that thread throughout the entire paragraph. So we're not actually having to do an in-text citation on every single sentence. Now, there are some things to keep in mind when doing this. So one thing to keep in mind as you're moving through and doing an in-text citation is that sometimes there are times when we do need to reestablish the in-text citation. So if you're talking about one article for the first part of the article, but then you start talking about another source, you will of course need to indicate to your reader that you're talking about another source, and so you'll need to establish the in-text citation for the new article. Also, if you're talking about one source and then you talk about that source in a second paragraph, in that second paragraph you need to do an in-text citation to let your reader know that you're talking still about the same source. Finally, though, my point is if you are unsure, always err on the side of oversighting rather than underciting. If you're not 100% comfortable with this yet and leaving out some citations and balancing the citations, always err on the side of oversighting rather than underciting, because underciting can be a form of plagiarism and have academic integrity implications. That sums up our bit on in-text citations. The next thing we're going to talk about are reference list citations. And so with the APA 7th edition manual, they introduced their 4 elements. And so the 4 elements of a reference list citation are who, so the author, when, the year, what, the title of the individual work, and then where, source information. I'm now going to talk about how to cite journal articles, books, and then web. Before I get started here, I did want to caution you about using citation tools. Even the library databases have cite this function. We know there's a lot of online tools, but those tools often make mistakes. And so I encourage you to go ahead and learn the fundamentals of the citation style so that at a later time, if you do end up using one of those citations, you know enough to be able to make those corrections and that you're informed enough to make sure that when you turn in your paper, that it's an actual correct citation. So basically, just don't trust those citation generators, learn some of the fundamentals, and then you'll be better prepared if you do decide to use any of those tools. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is an APA journal with a DOI. So effectively, a DOI is a digital object identifier. And so on the front face of a lot of articles, either at the top or the bottom of the individual journal article, you'll see this DOI. And usually the DOI is this 10 dot number. Sometimes you'll see https.doi.org and then the 10 dot number, but that is effectively a DOI. So for the authors, we're going to do last name followed by a comma and then the initials. And so here we have someone named Behrman, comma, S period, space, K period, comma, and there's a second author. So we're going to listen ampersand, and then all we have is their first name. So we do Stice, comma, E period. And so this is how you articulate authors in APA. I think it's kind of nice. You always only do last names and initials. And so you list every single person out until, of course, you get to 21 authors. But most of the articles you're going to run into, you will be listing out all the authors for a citation. The next thing we're going to look at is the date. And a lot of times on a journal article, either at the top of the page or the bottom of the page, you'll see a little citation statement. And this is where I'm pulling that information from. So we have like the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology, the date, the volume, the page numbers, the DOI. Look for that because that is the date you're going to want to include as you go through your citation. Now the date here is 2008, so I simply put after the author, I put the date, and then I follow that with a period. And then the next thing I'm going to include is the name of the article. So in this case, the name of the article is Testing a Gender Additive Model, the Role of Body Image in Adolescent Depression. And APA has some very specific rules for how you capitalize journal article titles. So effectively, we capitalize the first word of the title, and then all the other major words are lowercase. If we have a subtitle, we'll capitalize the first word of that, and again, everything else is lowercase. So if I had copied and pasted this, this would technically be incorrect because they capitalized all the major words here. So for APA, again, capitalize the first word, after the colon, capitalize that word. And then the exception to this is if you have any proper nouns. So if you have a person's name, you will of course capitalize that. We follow this with the name of the journal. So the name of the publication. And so this is beginning our source element. And so we have here the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology. Sometimes we'll see abbreviations with or on front pages of journals. We need to write out the full name of the journal. And what you'll notice is that all the major words are capitalized for the publication. And then you'll notice that this is also italicized. The next piece we have to include is the volume number. And we see here we only have a volume number. So if we have a volume number, we just include that. And that is also going to be italicized. So we put a comma, the volume number, italicize that, and follow that with a comma. Now, APA's rules for APA 7th are a little bit different if you've used APA 6 before. So the main change here is if you have a volume number and you only have a volume number, just put the volume number. If you have a volume number and an issue number, you can put the volume and the issue number. I'll show you an example on the next example for how to do that if you have a volume and an issue number. After the comma, effectively we put the full page range, so 1251 through 1263. We include that, and then we add a period. And then since we have a journal article with a DOI, we are going to include the DOI. But APA has some specific rules for how you articulate this DOI. So what we need to do, so we have the DOI, the 10 dot number here. So this is, it's in its essence what the DOI is. For the APA 7th edition, what they want you to do is start it out with https://doi.org/ and then the 10 dot number. What you'll also notice is that this is hyperlinked. So you can have URLs that are blue and underlined in APA 7th edition. Hyperlinks are okay in APA 7th edition. Now, one of the big things we see, and one of the main mistakes a lot of those citation generators do, is they include the name of the database. APA does not want you to include the name of the database anywhere in the citation. So we don't want to see Academic Search Premier, we don't want to see JSTOR, and they go into great detail on page 297 about not using database names. The next thing we're going to talk about is APA journal articles where no DOI is available. So if you don't have a DOI, so you don't have a 10 dot number available, and you found it through one of our library databases, you do not need to include a DOI at the end of your citation. So you start things out as you did with the one with a DOI. So exactly the same as an article without a DOI. So we start out with the author, and this has one author. And then we have our little citation statement here, and so we include the year 2000. And then we put the name of the article title, which is Gender and Religious Work. Notice I'm not going to capitalize the religious work in the title because we only capitalize the first word. And then I'm going to follow that with the name of the journal. In this case, the journal is a Sociology of Religion, and that will be italicized, and all the major words will be capitalized. And then here I do have a volume and an issue. So I see 61:4. That's telling me that I have a volume and an issue. So if I have a volume and issue, I will list the volume in italics. And then right after that, I will list the issue, but the issue is not italicized. So volume, issue, and then you'll notice there is no space between the volume and issue, but this one is italicized and this one is not. We follow that by a comma, and then at the very end, we include all the page numbers. And this is where we end our citation. So if you do not have a DOI and you access this through one of our library databases, you do not have to put anything after the page number. Now, following that same kind of model, when we deal with books or ebooks, we need to be considerate of whether or not it has a DOI or not. So with a book, if there is a DOI, and a lot of times we aren't going to find DOIs quite yet. DOIs are kind of a newer phenomenon for books. And so if you can't find a DOI, it is okay. Don't worry about it. But with a book, how we started out is this is an example of a book authored by one person. So I list out the name of the book, the name of the author, sorry, and then the date. And then I add in the name of the book. What you'll notice about the name of the book is that it is italicized. And we capitalize the first word of the book, and then after the subtitle, the the colon, we include the capitalization there, but everything else is going to be lowercase. One of the big changes to the 7th edition is that we no longer include the city and the state in our citations. So no longer New York, London, they don't care. So simply go ahead and skip that part and simply put in the name of the publisher. So this book was published by the American Psychological Association. And since we had a DOI available, I'm going to include the https://doi.org and then the DOI. Now, a lot of books that you're going to be encountering, so this next example is going to kind of be representative of what most of your book citations will look like. So if you have a book without a DOI, it doesn't matter if it's a print book or an electronic book from one of our library databases. So if you go in through our library catalog and you pull a book and it's electronic, You cite it exactly as you would a print book. So we list out all the authors, and then we include the date, and then we put the name of the book. Remember, we capitalize the first word and the first word after the subtitle. And then we put the name of the publisher and then end it with a period. I'm now going to talk about how to cite websites. So as we kind of mentioned earlier, sometimes you can have corporate authors. So if you found something and it was put out by the American Nurses Association and you can't find an individual person who authored it, that's fine. You can include the American Nurses Association as the corporate author. So for this first one, for example, we have something published by the American Nurses Association, so I include that as the corporate author and end that with a period. I wasn't able to find an individual date. You can put N period, D period for no date. Then we follow that with a period, and then we include the name of the website, and you'll notice you capitalize only the first word, and of course if there's a subtitle, you capitalize that first word, and you would also capitalize proper nouns. But one of the things you'll notice is that for the name of a website, it is always going to be italicized. And then after we include the name of the website, we end that with a period, and then we put the full URL to that individual website. One of the biggest changes is you no longer have to put retrieve from. We don't need access dates. Just put the URL, and that is all you need. Now, one of the newer things with the websites for APA is if you have a corporate source, you will include that. So for example, here we have a work authored by this individual, and so we include their name followed by their initials. And then since this is a page that kind of changes a lot, it's more informative for our readers to include the year as well as the date. So this is an example of a news article from NPR. So we include the date as well as the year. Then we put the name of the page in italics. And this is one of the big differences. This is the source. So since we have a source that is different from the individual author, so the source is NPR, we include that here and follow that with a period. Now, if this one had been authored by an individual but was on the American Nurses Association site, we would have done a similar thing in that we indicated the individual, and then we would have put American Nurses Association here, if that makes sense. Now again, we simply put the full URL to that individual article. The final thing I want to show you is if you have something by a governmental agency, for example, we start out by including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so this is the CDC. We have the date, we have the name of the page, and then in that source, the responsible agency, we do include the agency that, the larger agency that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention is a part of, which is the Department of Health and Human Services. We end that with a period, and then we include the URL to that individual web page. So this concludes my coverage of reference list citation basics. One thing to note is always remember that the reference page is always a separate page at the end of the document. You always include all of your works in alphabetical order, so they're in alphabetical order. And then at the very top of the page, the name of the page will be references. MLA does works cited, APA is references for the heading at the top of your reference list. The next thing we're going to talk about is paper format. With the 7th edition manual, you will notice that inside it there are two sample papers. There is a sample student paper and a sample professional paper. Most of you obviously will be using the sample student paper. If you don't have access to the manual, they do put the APA, a sample paper online at apastyle.org, and I'll kind of show you how to get to that a little bit later. And this can be very helpful for setting up your paper. So let's look at the elements of the APA paper in the 7th edition. There are some pretty significant changes between the 6th edition and the 7th edition. In my opinion, they make it a lot easier in the 7th edition. So At the very top of your paper, you will need to put a page number. So all you need to do is put the page number here and make sure you include a page number at the top of all of your pages. And then what you're going to do is come down from the header, and you can see that's the header, about 2 or 3 spaces, and then you're going to put the name of your paper. And so the name of your paper is going to be in bold, and you're going to capitalize all the major words of your paper. Now, in this version, APA has specified what we include on the front page of our paper. So between the title of our paper, which is in bold, we do double space everything, and then we add an extra space in between, and then we include our name, our department, USC-Aiken, the course number and title, your instructor's name, and then the date. And then for most papers at USC-Aiken, what you will see is a local request from your professors that you include the honor code at the very bottom of the page. And so include the honor code and then your name and then the date. If you submit it electronically, obviously you can just type in your name. If you are submitting it in print, you will need to write out your name. Now I'm going to show you what the body of your paper kind of looks like. At the very top of the second page, again, we're going to need to have that page number, and then we need to make sure that we have the title of the paper right under that heading level. And so we're going to take the title of the paper, so the exact same thing we had here, we're going to copy it, and we're going to paste it at the very beginning of our paper in bold. We do not include the word introduction at the very beginning of our paper. What we do is we include the name of our paper in bold. And then what we start doing is writing out our individual paper. Now in your paper, sometimes you can have different headings. And so that is to indicate to your reader that you have a different section. APA has very specific rules for how these headings are indicated. So for example, here we have a level 1 heading. A level 1 heading is centered and bold, and this kind of indicates that you have a major section. Now a subsection of that first heading is a level 2 heading, and so we indicate a level 2 heading by placing it to the left. All the major words are capitalized, and it is also bold, and then the text starts on the next line. So remember, a level heading is communicating to our reader that we have a major topic and then we have a subtopic. So a major topic is a level 1, a subtopic is a level 2. On your reference page, everything has a hanging indent, which means the first line hangs over and all the subsequent lines are indented, and there is a way to do this in your paragraph settings. So that, in summary, is how you do a APA paper, how to do the title page, how to articulate the headings, and also how to set up your reference page. The final thing we're going to talk about are some key new things with the 7th edition. One thing I did not mention earlier that some of you may have run across before is that there's now only one space after the period. But one of the big shifts is that the 6th edition was your guide to clear and concise writing. And what I really enjoy about the 7th edition is they have now expanded that to be your key to clear, concise, and inclusive writing. And so on chapters 4 and chapter 5, they have some guidance as to how we can be more inclusive. And so with the 7th edition is the recommendation of the use of the singular they. And so I'm going to go ahead and read this out because I think they articulate it so nicely. So writers should always use the singular they to refer to a person who uses they as their pronoun. Also use they as the generic third person singular pronoun to refer to a person whose gender is unknown or relevant to the context of the usage. It is acceptable to use they, them, their, theirs, themselves, or themself. And what I really enjoy about the new manual is on page 121, they include a chart with some examples and strategies for including they as the generic third person pronoun. The other thing they talk about is in chapter 5. They go into great detail about some updated guidance on reducing bias by topic, specifically age, disability, gender, racial and ethnic identity, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. So, for example, if you're working on a study, they are now recommending that instead of using the language under 18 years or over 865 years, that you do be specific about that date range. So, how to get help with APA 7th edition. The APA style site is actually very, very good. They have excellent examples. They have sample papers. I'll show you that in a second. The library help resources, we are updating our APA handout, and that should be out super soon. If you've watched this far into the future, there will already be an APA 7th handout available. We have also updated our library citation help pages, and then moving forward, all my APA writing workshops will be focused on the 7th edition. As for resources out on the Wild Wild Web, do make sure that if you are looking to sources outside of the APA Styles main page, that you are focusing on resources for the 7th edition. There's a lot of noise on the internet of the 6th edition still being out there, so make sure that you're looking for guidance on the right style side. One of the sites I can recommend is the Excelsior OWL. They have an excellent site to help with APA documentation. And one thing I will caution you about is our old friend OWL Purdue has a significant number of errors on their site. So at this time, I cannot recommend the OWL at Purdue's website for APA 7th edition citation. But Excelsior OWL does have some really excellent resources that are pretty good. So the best resource I can really recommend right now is the APA Styles page itself. And if you can find that by simply going out and searching for APA Styles 7th edition, make sure you pull the one that says apastyle.apa.org. Now here they have some style and grammar guidelines, and so if you click on here, you can get a quick link to some wonderful reference examples. So if you're working on your reference page and you need some examples, this page has some excellent examples, and it also shows you the parenthetical narrative citation. Then it talks about some of the rules that guided them in their decisions. And the other thing I wanted to point out are the instructional aids. This is where we're going to get our sample papers. And so if I go under instructional aids, you can see here there is a big category for sample papers, and so I can click on that. And then also I wanted to point out under handouts and guides, one of my favorite new things they've come out with is their reference quick guide. And this is a wonderful sheet giving you an overview of how to do a journal article, a book, or a chapter in an edited book. So this concludes my overview of APA 7th edition. Again, my name is Professor Harmon, and I am one of the instruction librarians over at the Greg Graniteville Library. If you need our help, go ahead and reach out to us. My email is deborah.t@usca.edu. Alternately, you can also access us by going to our library homepage and reaching out through the Ask a Librarian page. Happy searching!